Hey there, this is Sean Bodley with Clear Technologies, and I'm going to discuss and demonstrate some new service IP distribution policies that have been added in PowerHA version 7.1 as a whole. There's going to be references to these options that have added something called with or and source. And there's also something internally on how some of the previous options worked, where it automatically uses something called Firstalias. So let me get into these options here, which is everything you see listed here that has the source listed in blue. This was actually added in version 7.10. And I'm going to explain what exactly this new source option provides. You're also going to see the one listed at the end down here called Disable Firstalias. Now this is kind of interesting because this was actually added in a PTF. The earliest one that I found it was in 7.11, which leads me to believe that this Firstalias default behavior that I'm going to talk about and demonstrate was added in 7.11. So I believe that to be a true statement. I'm also going to say that about 90% of what I will say about these features are based off of personal experience. There is very little documentation on this subject. The base pubs today hardly even mention Firstalias. I know the Red Books we have a paragraph about this disable Firstalias, and that's about it. Nowhere does it ever mention that this behavior was added, nor in the internal material that we've historically gotten about new releases or the other sources of documentation like the readmes or so forth. So first of all, let me explain and show more about these source options. And what this is these are to address an issue that has been around ever since we introduced IP address takeover via aliasing. And the issue is, if you see on the right hand side, I've got a service IP address, which is an alias, is that when an alias is put on top, the default route and the responding IP address is the IP address of the first one configured on that subnet. So when a request comes in for the service IP address and then a connection is initiated coming back, it actually responds back as the boot IP. Now, for security purposes and on the firewalls on the network, this usually throws up a red flag and causes alerts that maybe there's an attempt of spoofing, or I don't know who you are and you should not be allowed. So this with source option actually gives us the ability to define a specific service IP address to always respond back as. So if and when this scenario occurs, it will reply back as the service IP. So any of those four options, I can set the source option for the service distribution policy. Now, what's actually been added, which it appears to have been in 7.11. Again, this is based on the fact that I found an APAR to disable it in 7.11. I don't believe 7.10 had this. I know for sure 7.12 and 7.13 has it. I expect that 7.11 has it, but I have not validated that. So out of these things, out of this bullet list here, the only thing on this list that came straight from documentation is the first sentence of the first bullet. This actually is documentation that came out of the 7.11 APAR to disable Firstalias, which is it automatically configures the service IP as an alias with a Firstalias option regardless of the user settings. What that means is that when we start the cluster, instead of the boot being the first initial address, it'll actually swap them. The service address will be put in place and then the boot will be on top of it. That's how the Firstalias works, and I'm actually going to show this in a demonstration here. So again, first bullet, first sentence is the only thing I've gotten from any other reference source. Even the next one that says it's the new inherit default, I added that statement. So The rest of these bullets, again, are based off of my personal experience. That says the default behavior does not apply if I have a persistent alias configured. Now, I don't know if that's on purpose or not. I'm telling you this is my experience. That when I have a persistent configured and I leave the default alone, I see the good old traditional iPad via aliasing method, which is it'll show boot, persistent, and service in that order, top to bottom, or actually the base address will be the boot address. The other thing that's a little bit weird here is that regardless if what the service distribution policy says, going back to the first bullet, is that the default is anti-collocation. Well, most environments are single adapter network configurations, and in a single adapter network configuration, other than the with source option, it almost doesn't matter what option you choose because all the addresses are going to end up on the same interface anyway. You don't have a choice. The only thing you can do is somewhat dictate if they come up first or not based on the source IP address. So when I create a new cluster, which I'm going to show in the demo, and leave the default of anti-collocation, and I start the cluster, I am going to see the service address be put in place first, and then the boot. I don't believe in the demo that I will actually show the persistent piece, but trust me, if I have a persistent configured and I leave the default and I start it, it looks like a traditional iPad via aliasing. The next one I tested, and I believe I do have this shown, which is, well, what happens if I have multiple service IP addresses? Well, which one gets listed first? By default, again, based on my own testing experience, I manipulated IP addresses and I manipulated names to see if it mattered by lowest IP or lowest alpha name. I also manipulated the order in which the service addresses were listed in the resource group to see if that mattered. Based on my testing, the result was it always appeared to be the lowest alpha sort name is what gets put in place first. So it would list it first, then it would actually list the boot IP address and then the next service address. Next bullet just says regardless if the boot and service are on the same or different subnets, it still functions the same way. So it doesn't matter if they're the same subnet or not. Most cases in a single adapter network, we do have the luxury of having boot and service on the same subnet, so they normally would be. And in that case, I probably wouldn't even have a persistent address because I really don't need one. Now, the next thing on here that says, if I don't want it to work this way, that's where this option was added to disable Firstalias. This will actually start treating it as a more, what I call, historic, traditional iPad via aliasing environment. And then if you actually want to use the with source option, you can also change it to the source and choose the specific service IP address. If you do have multiple service IP addresses, in that case, instead of straddling the IP addresses around the boot like I mentioned earlier on, it will list whichever one you prefer first, and then the next service after that, and then the boot last. So hopefully this all makes sense. Like I said, this is based off of my experience and my conclusions from testing this. If any of this is not working as intended, or your results are different, not only would I like to hear about it, but I strongly suggest opening a PMR with support line to get it resolved. So let me switch over now and actually start the demo. Okay, in order to show this new default behavior, I'm going to quickly create a 2-node cluster from scratch. So I have 2 nodes, DB2 and web. This is the DB2 node. This will be the primary node. So I'm going to add a cluster. I'm going to tell it web as the second node. This will actually run a quick discovery. So it will pull in the shared interfaces and the shared disks. I don't have a lot of disks, so it runs very quickly. Then I'm going to tell it I'm going to use unicast for the primary IP-based heartbeat, and then I'm going to choose the repository disk. In my case is HDisk1. Now usually at this point you would go ahead and synchronize the cluster to have it create the CAA cluster for you. The reason why we recommend doing it right now is because if there's a problem creating the CAA cluster, it makes it a little bit easier to troubleshoot because you don't just have as much as the HA cluster configured yet. Another valuable tip for this is to make sure you have debugging enabled of CAA in the syslog. That way, if and when a failure occurs, you can actually use the detailed information from the syslog output to actually debug the problem, because usually the error messages that you get from this creation is not quite as informative as we would like it to be, so doing it through syslog is quite valuable. That information on how to do that is actually documented in just about any of the HA version 7 Redbooks. Okay, so that's completed, and if I jump out and look, I've got my CAA VG private. I can do an LS cluster and say that I've got CAA cluster information here. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to go add a service address and then add it to a resource group, again just to purely demonstrate this behavior of the Firstalias. So I'm going to choose HASVC. Now I'm going to go and create a resource group and then add it into a resource. Add it to the resource group after that. And actually, I'm going to change the order here of my node list. I just want DB2 to be the primary, so it's not really that big a deal. And I'm going to change the behavior out of habit, but it's not really important for this demo. So now I need to add it. Got HASVC, and now I just need to jump out and sync up the cluster. While that syncs, I'm just going to pause the video for a minute just to help make this a little more time efficient. Okay, so the sync completed. Now before I actually start the cluster, I want to show the current settings. This is the default of anti-collocation now. In a single adapter network config, it really matters very little what your setting is set to, because all the IP addresses and services and aliases are all going to be put on the same interface because there's no choice. However, with the new with source options and this Firstalias default, it will dictate the order that the alias shows up. So this shows anti-collocation, but they really are going to be on the same place. So now I'm going to start the cluster. Actually, let me break out of that because I didn't show my before. There is my boot address, and with the Firstalias default, we're going to see the service address is going to be listed first, and then the boot. So let me now start the node. Okay, so now the node has started. If I look, I see it's online, and now if I check my netstat output, I see, boom, that the service is listed first. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the cluster on this node. So now it's stopped, and now I'm going to go change the service distribution policy option to disable Firstalias. So now I've changed it, and I need to sync up the cluster again. Okay, so now the sync is completed, and now I'll start the node again. And this time we will see what I call the more traditional aliasing method, where the alias will be put on top, or as far as the listing is concerned, it's lower in the list, but the service is the alias and doesn't get swapped like we just showed. Okay, so now if I check it, we will see that the service is listed kind of the more traditional method with iPad via aliasing. So now I will stop the node again. And so what happens when I have more than one service address with the Firstalias behavior? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go back and change the behavior back to anti-collocation, and actually it doesn't matter, we can change it to almost anything other than with source. I can change it to collocation for that matter, because that's really more of how it currently behaves with only a single adapter network. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to add a second service address on here. So go to resources, service, add, and we'll choose this one. Okay, so now I need to go back and add it to the resource group. Just be sure I choose both of them. And now I will sync up the cluster again. Okay, so the cluster is synced up. Now I just need to start it up again. Okay, so the cluster started, and now if I look at the output, I will see one service, the boot address, and then the other service. Now, what I have been able to come to a conclusion on, based on my testing, is that this order of how it chooses which one to put up there is based on alpha sort of the name. It's not based on the IP address. It's not lowest IP address because I have tested it, and that's where the bullet point came from in the slide. So if we actually wanted HASVC to show up first and be the response back through the network, and that's where the new service distribution policies of with source comes in. So I will actually turn around and show that as well. So let me stop the cluster real quick. Then I will change the setting to like collocation with source, and I will choose HASVC as the source IP address, and we will see that those addresses will be swapped. Oops, well, I could have got there, but let's do this shortcut. So now I'll do collocation with source, and I'll choose HASVC as the source. So now I'll sync up the cluster. So sync is completed. Now let's restart. So the cluster has restarted. Now if I look at the output, we will see that HASVC is now listed first because that is the source. And this really doesn't matter so much what order the other two are in, but we'll see that choosing the with source, it didn't straddle the service addresses around the boot, but it did list our preferred one first. So that pretty much concludes my demonstration on service distribution policy with the default Firstalias and using the new with source options. There's other ones for with source. I mean, you can do anti-collocation and use the persistent options, but the net effect is still the same. Once you choose the with source, you choose which one you want to be the source IP address, and it'll show up first in the list here. So that will conclude the demo. Of course, like always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email at sbodley@cleartechnologies.net. And again, thanks for watching.